to remind you, we want to welcome you. And Emily, our chair of our committee, asked me to remind you that next week, Reverend Peter Johansson from the Wisconsin Council of Churches is going to be here to talk about Afghan resettlement. So that should be very interesting. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Robert Enright of UW-Madison. And when it comes to professors, he's the real deal. He's good at teaching, he's good at research and outreach. So good, in fact, that he holds an endowed chair, which is the highest award given to university professors. And I first came to know Professor Enright, I think it was in 1987, when I was a student in one of his classes. And I started telling all my friends, wow, this professor is really good. And I wasn't alone because he's received several awards for his teaching. And his research is also cutting edge. He published the first ever study on person-to-person forgiveness. So he's often referred to as the father of forgiveness research. And he was named by Time magazine as the forgiveness trailblazer. So far, he's published 150 scientific publications and 7 books. And I have one of his books, autographed copy, on my bookshelf, The Forgiving Life. And his research doesn't just sit on the shelf. He pioneered forgiveness therapy, and he developed an early intervention program on forgiveness that he's used all over the world, in Iran, Israel, Greece, Monrovia, Northern Ireland, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And he's just genuinely a nice guy. Now, what evidence do I have for that? Well, he's holding a forgiveness conference this summer at the Fluno Center on July 19th and 20th. And he told me that he will waive the $60 registration fee for members of our church. So if you just email him. So the title of his talk is Bible and Science Agree. Forgiveness is good for individuals, families, and communities. And so, Bob, I don't know, we probably got about, would you say 20 or 25 people here in the room, anxious to hear from you. So take her away.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And thank you all for putting up with me today and letting me talk with you. As Karen said, my chosen topic is forgiveness at the university. And here's how that happened. When I was hired in 1978 to study moral development within the Department of Educational Psychology, everybody, it seems, was studying one question. How do children and adolescents come to think about fairness? How do they grow in their complexity of thinking about justice? And I was a very obedient academic. I fell right in line. I studied that. It was very, very good to me. I got grants with it. I got tenure with it. And then one day I awakened to ask myself a very dangerous question. And it was this: who am I helping with this research? And I concluded that I was helping a few of my colleagues with whom I would interact at conferences once or twice a year. We'd pat each other on the back, then we'd go back to our laboratories and continue with this, helping no one. And that was 1985. And so at that point, I decided to, what I say, throw all my research over a cliff. I didn't want to study how children and adolescents think about fairness anymore. But I didn't have a new topic. But I knew I had to do something that was relevant to humanity. And then into my office one day walked a Brazilian graduate student, Maria Santos, who said, I'm out of money. I'm going to go back to Brazil without my master's degree. Tell me what to do for my master's degree. I thought to myself, and didn't say it to her, but I thought to myself, well, Maria, this isn't the way it goes. You're supposed to tell me what you want to do and I'll help you. But because she was in such dire straits, I thought about it. I actually prayed about it for Maria. And one word started coming up for me, forgiveness. And I thought, forgiveness, I had never heard of it before in the context of the social sciences. And so I thought, well, since I study moral development and forgiveness is so relevant to all of us, maybe there's published literature on that topic in the social sciences. So I actually, in 1985, had to walk all the way to the library to do a computer search of the literature with the librarian in a very large mainframe computer, because we didn't have Google at the time. And so about a half hour later, she came back with a blank sheet of paper. And she said to me, I cannot find even one published article in the social sciences on the topic of forgiveness. And I thought, wow, well, how about that? So I started talking to graduate students within my own department from very different worldviews, Greece, Israel, Brazil, the United States. And we formed what's called the Friday Forgiveness Seminar in 1985. That's still running with a whole different cast of characters now, of course. And in that seminar, we started asking 3 questions. I'm a slow learner because I'm still on these 3 questions today, 37 years later. What is forgiveness? How do you go about forgiving? And what happens when you forgive? And that's going to be the basis of my talk here with you today. What is forgiveness? How do you go about it? And what happens when you do? But little did I know when I started studying forgiveness in 1985, what a firestorm I was creating in academia. Here's some examples. My grants dried up. All right? One professor went to one of my best students and said, don't work with Enright anymore. He has ruined his career by studying such a weak, irrelevant topic to hard-headed academia. You, meaning the student, will never get a job within academia if you keep studying this topic. And the student came to me and she was pale and scared. And she said, is that true that I will never get a job? And I looked at her and said, well, I don't know. It's such a new topic. It's possible that this might happen. And she engaged in the moral virtue of courage, continued anyway, published one of the best articles I've ever seen on forgiveness therapy with incest survivors, and the rest is history for that one. But we kept getting all kinds of criticism for this weak topic. Oh, and by the way, how was your Christmas Day this past year in 2021? Did you have a good Christmas Day? Well, I was dealing with a death threat that day. I received an email from someone saying I should be put away from this earth because I study forgiveness. And the point was that if we emphasize forgiveness, we de-emphasize technology. And as we de-emphasize technology, we de-emphasize this person's comfort. And I am a threat to humanity. And it would be better if I died. Oh, while we're on the topic, how was your New Year's Day? Celebrating the new year, festivities this year? I received a second death threat from the same person who said I should not be here because I study forgiveness. What was your last 2 weeks? At the university, I have an answering machine on my phone that lasts for 5 minutes and then people get cut off. I received a 5-minute voicemail with someone yelling at me, cursing at me, calling me all kinds of names because I study forgiveness. And I talked about forgiveness in the context of Ukraine. And this person thought I was totally bonkers, got cut off after 5 minutes, called me back and gave me 5 more minutes of this. And everything the person said suggested to me that this person woefully misunderstands what forgiveness is. And yet, like the person who threatened my life, thought I was the scum of the earth because I study forgiveness. So in other words, my life, having come into this area of forgiveness, even 37 years later, is controversial. But you know what? I can't quite say I love every minute of it. That might be an exaggeration, but it sure keeps life interesting. And I know I'm onto something very, very, very important. Because what forgiveness does is it changes the heart. And when forgiveness changes the heart, it can actually change relationships. And there are people in the world who'd rather power over others rather than equal humanity, where we can try to get along. And forgiveness, I think, is so important because it is medicine for the heart and relationships that can actually cure toxic anger that fuels wars. Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic philosopher and priest, once said, "We are not at peace with others because we are not at peace within ourselves." That's what forgiveness is all about. To first do surgery of your heart, and from there bring peace to those within your own community and maybe larger than that. So with that introduction, let me go through the 3 questions that our Friday Forgiveness Seminar has been attending to for the past 37 years. First question, what is forgiveness? The woefully misunderstood topic that can lead to people wanting to kill me. Forgiveness, I have come to realize, is a moral virtue, as are justice and patience and kindness and love. And moral virtues are all centered on goodness starting within your own mind and heart, flowing out to others for their good. For example, justice is knowing what fairness is, and then having a fair exchange with other people. If you ask a carpenter to build a table for you for $100 and it happens, you hand over the money, they hand over the table. It's a fair exchange of goodness. Forgiveness is a very particular moral virtue. It is, I think, the most heroic moral virtue on the planet because it is being good to those who are not good to you. That's why I think it's so controversial. Enright, what are you talking about? Be good to those who are not good to you? Why not go after them? Why not be mean back to that person? Be strong, be powerful in this world. Be good to those who aren't good to you? Yes. And when you practice forgiveness, there are 3 components to what I call a formal definition of forgiveness. 3 points. Number 1, first, it is always and without exception in the context of being treated unfairly by others. That's where it centers. When you're treated unfairly by others, forgiveness is possible. Number 2 part of the definition. When you forgive, you deliberately try to get rid of the resentment in your heart that can build up when people treat you unfairly. And you deliberately try to get rid of the negative resentment for the other's sake. Sure, it can be for your sake as well, but primarily it's for the other. And third, here's where forgiveness really gets controversial because it's a moral virtue. When you're treated unjustly by others, there is a gift that flows out from you to the other person because that's what a moral virtue is. So you deliberately try to be kind to the person, respectful, generous, or even loving toward that other person. What's the definition of forgiveness? You've been treated unfairly by others. You try to get rid of the negative. the toxic poison of resentment in your own heart, and you try to offer a gift of some kind to the other who was not good to you. But there's more to the definition. It's what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not just caving in and saying what happened to me is fair. When you forgive, you do not excuse what the other did to you. What the other did was unfair, is unfair, and will always be unfair. You don't excuse. You may or may not reconcile. Right? If the person keeps beating you over the head with a frying pan and you say, please stop that, and the person says, no, it's fun, you can stay away from the person. And I think that's one reason why forgiveness is so controversial. Many people misunderstand it and think that when you forgive, you must go back into the nonsense of an abusive relationship. But no, you can forgive by getting rid of resentment, offering goodness from a distance, a kind word about the person to family members, without entering back into a relationship that we call reconciliation. Forgiveness is a moral virtue. Reconciliation is not. Reconciliation is a negotiation strategy of two or more people coming together again in mutual trust. Sometimes we can't be mutually trusting because the other refuses your gift. So you can forgive without reconciling. And another point, very important, about what forgiveness is not, when we forgive, Aristotle taught me this, by the way, you always practice this moral virtue and any moral virtue with other moral virtues. You don't practice moral virtues in isolation. And so when you forgive, you bring justice alongside, forgiveness and justice. So you can forgive someone who's treating you unjustly and at the same time, ask for this fairness. Incorporate justice into the equation. The person still might not accept that, and then you cannot reconcile, but you then have done the very best you can. So those last 2 points, I think, are what makes forgiveness so controversial. We do not have to reconcile, and we do bring justice along with us. It makes sense, this idea of not practicing any of the moral virtues in isolation. And here's an example again. Let's say you are a courageous non-swimmer. You have the virtue of courage and you don't know how to swim. And you look out at Lake Mendota and you see a drowning dog. Well, unless you bring wisdom along with courage, you might jump into that lake to save the drowning dog, only to drown yourself because you don't know how to swim. So when you practice courage, you must practice wisdom. When you practice forgiveness, you should bring justice along with you. So that's what forgiveness is. And I think forgiveness itself takes a hit because people presume they understand what it is, and they go ahead anyway and criticize you because they're really not getting the truth of what it is. That's our first question. And what I also find really interesting about the answer to this is when we formed our Friday Forgiveness Seminar, we looked at, because I'm an egghead professor now, we looked at every kind of religious thought, philosophical thought on forgiveness that we could ever find. So we searched the Hebrew, Christian, Islamic literature, Hindu, Buddhist, humanistic, atheistic literature, and we found that this three-part definition that I just gave you seems to be objective and universal. It cuts across the different kinds of worldviews and is not just embedded in one particular kind of worldview or one kind of religion. I have found actually that the very first idea of forgiveness occurred in the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to turn this down a little because I see some shining light there. So let me just make sure you have kind of a proper way to do this. Okay. Is that a little bit better there? Too much shine there? Okay. The very first attempts at thinking about forgiveness in any depth at all comes to us from Hebrew scripture. It comes to us from Genesis 37 to 45 with Joseph forgiving his half-brothers. And you know the story well. What happened there is the brothers were jealous of him, threw him down a well to kill him. They changed their mind, brought him out. You think once they dusted him off, everything would be fine. But what happened there is they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And when they came down, they didn't know that he was in a very high governmental position. He's supposed to be a slave there. And they asked Joseph, without even knowing that Joseph was standing before them, for help with famine in the Hebrew nation. He threw him into prison, asked to see Benjamin. They came back, and he even continued to play a trick on them by putting a silver goblet into the knapsack of Benjamin. They were almost out of town, and he had his army come and accuse Benjamin of theft. And at that point, one of the half-brothers rented his own garment. In other words, it's more of an analogy with Jesus sacrificing for others, and said, "Take me instead." And Joseph unconditionally, without condition, without an apology, they didn't apologize to him. They didn't know he was Joseph. He embraced them, he wept, and he gave them all kinds of provisions and food. And did you ever think about it before? Joseph's forgiving helped save the Hebrew nation. And without Joseph forgiving his half-brothers, the Hebrew nation wouldn't have thrived, continued to the Christian nation. And those of you who are Christian now owe a debt to the forgiving nature of Joseph thousands of years ago. And we need to thank Joseph for what he did. I relate that story not just because it was the first one in any kind of literature I can find, but also because I want you to realize how important forgiving actually is. It's a vital, vital topic. No wonder some people seem to hate it. Karen and I were talking before I started this little talk here, and she and I agreed that when we hear Jesus saying, "Woe to you if everyone speaks well of you," well, if you talk about forgiveness, welcome to the club. People won't necessarily speak well of you because it's so important. And in the New Testament, we see a parallel with Joseph forgiving his half-brothers in the prodigal son. And it's very similar. The prodigal son was very nasty to his Hebrew father, disrespecting him, asking for an inheritance before the father was deceased. My goodness, that's not a very good thing for a Hebrew boy to do. Then he left the farm rather than working on the farm, became destitute and actually had to work on a pig farm. Not a very nice thing for a Hebrew boy to do. He decided to go home. The father, if he's a human father, not the heavenly father, wouldn't know why the prodigal son was coming back home. Maybe he was coming back home to get his laundry done, or maybe he was coming back home to get more money. But what did the father do? Without the prodigal son even apologizing, the father ran to the son and unconditionally embraced him, loved him, not even knowing why the son was there. So we have unconditional ideas, both in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, that when you are hurt by others, you can go ahead and unconditionally start forgiving and offering that goodness, even if the other does not repent, even if the other is not sorry, even if the other does not have those three little words, "I am sorry." You can go ahead with the goodness toward those who have hurt you. And so I am indebted to the Hebrew scriptures and those who wrote them down and preserved them and the Christian scriptures who teach us how to unconditionally love those who are not loving us. So that's our first of three questions. Our second question, we've been spending a lot of time on this in my research lab, is how do you go about forgiving? How do you do it? Well, the scriptures are there, as we know, to save souls. Their job is theological. It's not psychological. And of course, we get lots of good tips from the Old and New Testaments, especially the grace of God. You really, I think, need the grace of God if you are going to forgive well. But I'm approaching this from one of the most radically secular universities in the world, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So our question was, how do you go about forgiving from a psychological pathway that might be useful to people who are hurting deeply? And so with that in mind, what we did is we started looking at stories. Right? Again, Karen Bogenschneider and I, before this little talk, were talking about the importance of stories because we remember stories. Well, that's how we started. We started looking at people's printed stories, and there were some of those, of people who've been hurt very deeply by other people and how they ended up forgiving others. And so we would ask, well, what happened first? Then what happened after that? And what was the person doing and thinking and feeling when forgiving? And we developed a pathway, what I call the roadmap of forgiveness. And it became what we call the process model. And then we brought this roadmap to hundreds of people and said, here's a roadmap of forgiving. Please look at it relative to how you have forgiven others. And tell me what's wrong with our roadmap, what is wrong with the sequence, maybe we should move things around, until we finally got what we thought was a definitive roadmap that's still loose in the sense that not everybody goes through it in the exact same way I'm about to describe to you, but is a general pathway that is quite acceptable. And I don't think our roadmap is the only way to get to forgiveness. I think there are many, many, many ways. But if I give you a roadmap from Madison to Chicago that is straight and someone else gives you the scenic route, you'll get there either way, but ours would be effective in having you go straight down the highway. Well, it's like that with our process model of forgiveness. It's one way of going about forgiving that, for the third question, what happens when you do, I'll show you it's effective. So if you want to forgive someone, right, first of all, as I even got the topic of forgiveness through helping the Brazilian student Maria Santos, I started praying about it for her. I think you need to be in prayer about your forgiving. I think you need the grace of God. I really do. Okay? When I talk to secular audiences, that's not open to them because they have rejected that. So I give them the straight up psychology. But for you, sitting with me here today, I would say, don't do it without your best friend, Jesus Christ. Right? Because apart from him, you can do nothing. So here's the pathway. You definitely need to bring your best friend on that pathway with you, Jesus Christ. You have an advantage because you have the grace right there to be able to appropriate this roadmap. And the roadmap does get us to forgiveness, but it takes a while. I use the idea roadmap because you're going on a journey. And I'm going to introduce you to that journey today, but this journey can take weeks or months. And so think of this as my opening up the roadmap to you, but there's more to it than 20 minutes while we get together one time for a little talk. Right? So here's the roadmap, what I call the process model of forgiveness. We break it down into 4 phases. And I use the word phase because if you think about the phases of the moon, they're gradual and they're transforming in a way toward different kind of shapes. Well, this is a transforming path that takes time. You don't just say, I forgive you, man, and that's the end of it. No, you walk a path. In a certain way, you're taking up your cross and daily walking the Via Dolorosa for the one who hurt you. And as Christians, that's what you're basically doing. So the first phase we call the uncovering phase. In its pre-forgiveness, we ask people to courageously look at the effects on them for what has unjustly happened to them. And I have been surprised at how many different effects there actually are when you have been treated very badly by others. Even psychology has missed this. Even psychiatry has missed this, where you might have been hurt 20 years ago, and you still might be carrying in your heart the effects of what happened to you 20 years ago. And so when you go for help, people talk with you about what's happening now, and they don't connect your sadness, your discontent today with what happened to you 20 years ago. So there's been a lack of sight, even in the helping professions, the mental health professions themselves. And so here are some examples of what we find in the uncovering phase. When people have been treated very unfairly by others, they get angry. And I think that's good in the short run because it shows you're a person of worth and people should not treat you this way. But when the anger takes up residence in your heart and turns from anger to resentment, which I call anger on steroids, that resentment is a very unwelcome guest. That resentment takes up residence in your heart and refuses to leave. I have worked with people in hospice situations who were hurt 40 years ago, and they're still carrying around the rust of resentment in their own hearts today. And so resentment is a big one. Rumination, thinking over and over about it, is another one. I worked with a young man in college whose father used to beat him when he was a child. Every night this young man went to bed, he would dream of his father chasing him. He knew what his dreams would be, right? And he forgave and that dream left. You know what the biggest complaint I get in the uncovering phase of an effect of something that might have happened years ago? Fatigue, tired. Think of it. Let's say someone treats you unfairly and you have a sack of potatoes on your back now, and each potato represents a wound from that person who treated you unfairly and maybe others. Well, carrying that around all day is going to make you tired. And another one that happens as an effect, pay attention to this, you churchgoers, those who would like to draw more people into Christianity. A big issue I see as an effect of being treated unjustly is a worldview that becomes pessimistic. A worldview that says everyone's out just for themselves, including anger with God, blaming God for others' injustices, blaming the church, and leaving the church, which might be the source of grace to help them over all this. And I consider that a tragedy. Effects of injustice now, of the injustices that happened 20 years ago, can lead to people leaving their best friend who might be giving them the grace to get over that toxic resentment that might be living in their hearts that they take to the grave. That's the uncovering phase, and it's eye-opening for many people. Then comes the second of four phases, the decision phase. What's that? That's, well, do you want to try forgiveness? Do you want to choose forgiveness? I don't want to drag you across the street to the forgiveness way. Do you willingly choose to forgive? In which case, You will be trying to get rid of resentment, offering goodness. You won't excuse, you may or may not reconcile, and you will ask for justice. Do you want to try it? Most people have tried everything under the sun to get rid of the rust of the toxicity of resentment. Most people at that point say yes. So then we go to the third of 4 phases, and that one is the work phase. Here we roll up our sleeves and hit the forgiveness gym, everybody. We try to become forgivingly fit, right? It's like becoming physically fit. We don't say to become forgiving, to become physically fit, let's all run a marathon for our first day in the gym, right? No, we say, let's walk around the block. Let's do 2 push-ups. And we gradually build up to greater fitness. It's the same with forgiveness. And so we start with thinking exercises because we are in more control of our thinking than our feeling. We're more control of the head than the heart. And so what we do is we ask you to think of the one who hurt you in broader, deeper terms. We ask you to think about the person first in what we call the personal perspective. Who is this person who hurt you other than the injustices against you? Is this person more than those injustices against you? For example, might this person have been treated so unfairly by others in the past that this person now has toxicity, didn't know what to do with that, and then dumped the truck onto you? Where are that person's wounds? From where did those wounds come? Is the person wounded in heart and mind and soul? Is the person possibly confused as to how to get along with others? Maybe this person has that idea of a worldview that has slid into negativism, where the person isn't quite aware of how to interact in a loving way now anymore, because of all the wounds perpetrated onto that person. Is that possible? Most of us know those who hurt us, and we can answer those questions. That's the personal perspective. Then we have the global perspective. Is this person a human being? Are you a human being? What does it mean to be a human being? It means you're unique, special, and irreplaceable. I'll prove it to you. Do you have unique DNA where there's really no other person like you on the planet, never will be? That makes you very special and unique. Well, how about the one who hurt you? Do you share humanity? Do you share worth, what we call inherent built-in worth that cannot be earned? Even an atheist is going to agree with me on this, because the atheist looking biologically at people will agree we all have unique DNA. Even a scholarly atheist will agree with me, because we can discuss the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, who's probably the world's foremost Western philosopher today from hundreds of years ago. Immanuel Kant, who said this: all people are ends, E-N-D-S. All people are ends in and of themselves and should be treated as such. Oh, really? Even the one who hurt you? You both share uniqueness. You both are ends in and of yourselves and should be treated as such, even if that person hurts you? Yes. You both need good nutrition. You both need air to breathe. If you both cut, you bleed. You're both going to die one day. You share a common humanity. That's what we mean by the global perspective. Increasing, expanding, and deepening your story of who this other person is. And then we hit the cosmic perspective of thinking. And I only do this with people who have a belief system that transcends the material world, that transcends atheism. The cosmic perspective presumes that you know each of you has a soul, that there's more to this life than tables and chairs and flesh and blood, that there's something transcendent about us. And if that's true, then let's go back again to Genesis. Instead of chapter 37, let's go all the way back to the very first book of Genesis, where it says, we are all, drum roll please, we are all made in the image and likeness of God. And if you reread that short first chapter, must be very important because that's how it started. That's how the Hebrew scripture started with this. Did you realize that in that first chapter of the first book, it repeats that we are made in the image and likeness of God? How often do you see the Bible repeating? And in the very first book of the Old Testament, it repeats that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. Does that mean the one who hurt you is made in the image and likeness of God? Oh, I guess so. You Christians, I have a question for you. Did Jesus die for the one who hurt you? Did Jesus die for that person's sins? The person might not accept that, but did Jesus die for that person's sins? How about for your sins? So who is this person who hurt you? Let's put the three thinking together, these three thoughts. The person may be wounded, and out of that woundedness wounded you. You and this person have inherent and built-in worth that you share in common. And you're both made in the image and likeness of God, and Jesus Christ died for both of you. When you look at the other from that perspective, is that person more than those actions against you? And when you start thinking that way, what we find is the heart starts to soften. You start seeing the person in a new way, and a little bit of compassion or suffering along with, that's what compassion is, begins to emerge for that person in your heart. And when your heart starts getting a little compassion, that rust of resentment doesn't like that. And that's when the rust of resentment we find starts to diminish. The poison starts to diminish, at which point we then ask the person in this work phase to what we call stand in the pain or bear the pain of what happened. Why? If you bear the pain, you're not throwing it back to the one who hurt you. If we keep taking an eye for an eye, the whole world will be blind. Gandhi told me that, right? I learned that from studying Gandhi's work. If we keep taking an eye for an eye, the whole world will be blind. But if you stand in the pain and bear the pain, you won't keep throwing back your revenge onto the other who throws the revenge back onto you, and on it goes. You, Christians, have the role model for bearing the pain. Who bore the pain for you on the cross of Calvary 2,000 years ago? Who bore the pain for you and the one who hurt you on Calvary 2,000 years ago? When you bear the pain, you are imitating Jesus Christ. You are standing in the pain. You might even, if it's so bad, have been, in a certain sense, been crucified, if you will, because of what the person did to you. You now have your role model, your best friend, to whom you can go to help you complete this pathway. And once you become strong in bearing the pain with and for Jesus Christ, getting to know him even better through your pain, because you're uniting your pain with his pain, that might enrich your relationship with your best friend. Then you are ready to put into full force the meaning of the moral virtue of forgiveness by giving a gift to the one who hurt you. What might that be? How about a returned phone call or an email or a kind word about the person to your family if you can't reconcile with the person? There are many ways. You can donate to a charity in the person's name if the person's deceased, you see. There are many ways to give this gift, but keep in mind that giving a gift to one who hurt you is very controversial in our fallen world. What are you doing giving a gift to one who hurt you? What's wrong with you? How dare you? That's ridiculous. Well, that's the world talking. That's not the startling revelation of Jesus Christ, right? Who stood the whole world on its head by introducing us to divine forgiveness. And so then we enter the discovery phase, which is our fourth of 4 phases. What we tend to discover when we walk this pathway of forgiveness is that we develop new meaning and purpose in life. We're more attuned to the sufferings of others. If you're standing in a long cashier's line and the person checking you out is having a hard day, excuse me, instead of getting annoyed, you might smile and say, thank you for your service, because you're more attuned to the suffering heart, you see. While others are getting annoyed when they finally get up there, you might cheer that person. Why? Because you've suffered, you know that person's been on that person's feet for 8 hours. And you find new purpose in life. We work in prison settings, and I hear this rather frequently, where someone will say to me, I'm never getting out of here, but my new purpose in life is to help my cellmates to get rid of the poison of resentment in their hearts, and I'm dedicating my life to that. I just had a phone call with someone who has 14 more years in prison, and he wants to start an online forum that I will lead for others in prison to turn backwards in time to those who abuse them so much that they've acted out in rage toward others, and now they're in his case for 14 years, and many others with whom I speak for life. Right? That's his new purpose in life. And so that ends our roadmap, which you can use over and over and over for the rest of your life for people who've hurt you in the past and people who hurt you now. So what about our third question? What happens when you forgive? Well, here's some of our studies quickly. Suzanne Friedman and I did a study that was published in the mid-1990s with incest survivors, one of the worst tragedies known to humankind, where a father or father figure abuses rather than protects. We had 12 incest survivors, and Suzanne, in her gentleness, asked 6 of them, randomly assigned to the forgiveness condition, would you like to try forgiving your father? And every one of them said no. And they were very kind about it. They said, I'm going to be the one person ruining your study because I won't forgive. And Suzanne said, come anyway. So she worked one-on-one with 6 incest survivors, one-on-one for an hour a week for over a year. And the control group could seek therapy as they wished. And at the end of that year, those who had the forgiveness condition went from clinically depressed to non-depressed. Their depression didn't just get better, it went to non-depressed status, which is very unusual in the psychological sciences to see that kind of improvement. But what about the control group? They were seeking therapy, they were still clinically depressed. Suzanne then took them under her wing. 1 hour a week, one-on-one for over a year. You know what happened to them? They went to non-depressed status. Well, what about the first group now that didn't have any therapy for a full year? They were still non-depressed. It stayed with them. And Suzanne still talks with some of these people decades later, and they say, this saved my life. As I say, we've worked in a maximum security prison setting. And all of the men with whom we worked were clinically angry, anxious, and depressed. And about 90% of 100 men with whom we assessed on their level of abuse against them, 90% of them had horrendous abuses against them before they landed in jail. Their stories would make you cry. And when they finally see a connection between their horrendously suffered abuse from others and their rage, it can become curative. A light bulb goes on. Sylvester Jackson, who was in that study, is going to be giving a talk at our July conference at the Fluno Center this year. He said it turned him around. And he's working now in Milwaukee with those who are coming out of prison to help them turn back in time so that they can get rid of the rust of resentment that was destroying them and in fact destroying others. That's why resentment, hidden for so long, even in the social sciences, must come to the fore. And we must give it its due so we can cure it. We've worked with women who have gone through very difficult divorces and the post-traumatic stress goes down. We've worked with people in drug rehabilitation. We've even worked with acid burn victims in Pakistan who are scarred for life because of revenge by a partner. And those who learned to forgive, their hope increased. Those who didn't have forgiveness, their hope was going down a year later, and I'm worried about them. They need, if they wish, to learn to forgive. And I want to leave you with one thought, and then I will open it up for questions. What will be your legacy in this world when you die? I'm not talking about leaving the rocking chair to the grandkids. I'm talking what the intangible legacy you will leave. I work in war-torn areas of the world, such as Belfast, Northern Ireland, Liberia, Africa, the West Bank, and Israel. And you know what I find? A lot of times anger seems to be passed down through the generations. And people, without realizing it, are leaving anger to their children's children's children. My challenge to all of you is this. Could you start a forgiving pathway today with your best friend, Jesus Christ, and get to know him more intimately and learn to love those who have not loved you, so that when you are no longer on this earth, your love can be in the minds and hearts of those with whom you have interacted, so that your love 200 years from now could actually be alive and well in your children's 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 children? It's possible, but we must start today. I'm going to stop here and open up to questions, doubts, anything at all.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was very inspiring. Who has questions here? Questions? We have one.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if if you think in your observations, there's a difference between when the perpetrator has not asked for forgiveness, has no remorse, and when the victim is able to achieve forgiveness, is that forgiveness deeper when there has been a remorse expressed, or is there, do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. We find that it's easier to forgive when the other says, I'm very sorry, I'm not going to do this again, and they mean it. Yes, that helps with your roadmap of forgiveness and your journey, yes. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be deeper. And it doesn't mean it's going to be hurt, your forgiveness pathway, if the person doesn't do that. Why? Because forgiveness is your choice to begin this, offering this moral virtue, and your giving of this gift is not dependent on anything else out here. It's dependent on your mind and heart and the grace given to you to accomplish this. Yes, it's easier, but you can still go ahead and accomplish it very well, even if the other spurns what you've done and says, no, I've never done anything, you're being too sensitive, get over it. You can realize that's not true, be hard-headed enough to say, I'm still going to go ahead and forgive with very good results. I see John with a hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I guess hearing the word resentment throughout your presentation, it brought to mind the fact that there are people that attitudes that people have resentments against whole classes of people, you know, the people on the other side of the political fence and that sort of thing. And I know what you're talking about is mainly kind of a one-on-one kind of relationships and the aftermath of that. But I just wondered if you could comment on how this is related to how people, build resentments against whole classes of people that they don't even know.
It's a very important question, and we deal with something called group forgiveness. And we think there is such a thing as group forgiveness, where entire groups can begin thinking about entire other groups. But you know what? I think they need that individual growth in the moral virtue, because if we have, let's reduce it for more simplicity. Let's say we have 10 and 10 rather than 5 million and 10 million. Let's say we have a group of 10 and a group of 10. If our group, let's say, John, you and I are part of one group, can in fact grow within ourselves and understand and practice forgiveness, that becomes a norm. That becomes a norm in our group. And then we can see the inherent worth in the other people. Right? And as we see the inherent worth in the other people, if they too can end up growing in the moral virtue as individuals, they can see that as a group norm, and there will be much greater harmony. I actually talked about that recently in a Psychology Today, a national magazine for which I'm a blogger. And I talked about this with regard to forgiveness education in the long haul for the Ukrainians, because I'm very, very fearful for the resentment they will carry in their heart. And I think that's going to be much worse than the war. I'm sorry to say that, but I think what they will carry after this is much worse than bombs. And I said, we're not talking about forgiveness education now toward Russia. We're talking about in their own community, in their own classrooms. That's why we need forgiveness education, starting in pre-kindergarten, where they talk about forgiveness through stories. And if someone pushes me down on the playground, if I'm 6 years old, and you become strong in forgiveness, so that eventually they might be able to turn this toward their own community and eventually toward those who are bombing them. And unless they do that, you know what I think is going to happen? There's going to be resentment. That's going to be the effect of war that nobody is seeing, and it's going to continue for generations. But you know what? That person who yelled at me for 5 minutes on my phone and then hung up and gave me 5 more minutes was reacting to that essay. He totally misunderstood me and thought I was asking the Ukrainians to forgive now when the bombs are dropping. No, and to lie down and die and let the Russians have their way, to excuse, to reconcile, and to have no justice. That person didn't understand. So I'm fearful for that, not only for that person, but everyone who's going to misunderstand how to develop a healing in hearts that flow out to the group unless we bring forgiveness into the equation eventually. That's me talking from 20 years in Belfast, Northern Ireland, okay? And working in Liberia, and working in the West Bank in Israel. People don't get it. And I understand that because we haven't put forgiveness on the table clearly enough, loudly enough, and frequently enough for people to get it. Do I fear for humanity? Yes. Is this why I do what I do? Yes. And I don't care if I get death threats. We've got to do it. So thank you for that question. You're, I think, 100% right. I wish the world would get it. Jocelyn, yeah, Jocelyn, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm curious if the Friday Forgiveness Seminar is a closed group or if it's open to the public.
Well, it actually can be open. I never had quite thought about it because we are meeting by Zoom. So if you want to email me, we can get you in. Because we're nearing the end of the semester, we're only going to meet about 3 more times. But we are going to meet on, I think it's May 6th. Let me take a look at this. May 6th, where we're bringing in about 100 teachers from Greece who are going to share with us what they're doing in Greece. Greece has had a very checkered history with Turkey, for example, and they have a very difficult issue with immigration right now. And they have embraced forgiveness education on a very large scale in Corinth, Athens, Thessaloniki. And so they're coming in then. And our next one, let's see, when is our next one? Let me see. we are meeting again on April 1st, where a South Korean student who just became Dr. Wangin, he just got his doctorate, is going to be talking with us about a forgiveness intervention with adolescent females in a detention center in South Korea and how that helped them become healthier. So email me, please. Karen Bogenschneider has my email, and I'll definitely patch you in. And we're meeting 3 times, and then we start again in September.
Thank you. I have another question.
Sure.
What happened to the Brazilian student? Was she able to finish her degree?
She totally finished her degree. I had the honor of publishing the very first social scientific journal article ever in the history of the social sciences with her. And it ended up in the Journal of Adolescence in 1989. And so because of Maria Santos, I had the honor of being one of the people to publish the very first social scientific empirically based article ever in 120 years of the social sciences. Thank you, Maria Santos, for coming to me humbly, and I tried to be your servant. When we're other servants, good things happen.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
one more
you.
question here.
I want to thank you very, very much for a lot of those definitions that I think bring clarity. And the one question I have is, do you have a nice tidy little book that would summarize all this?
Let's see. I do have a number of tidy little books. Also, I'm a blogger, as I had said, in Psychology Today. And it's probably, I have about 100 articles there. So I'd have to look and see which ones are really tidy, because those are, if it's more than 1,000 words, they don't forgive me. And they ask me to cut it down and write. So there's no more than 1,000 words on that. But I would say my tidiest book would be Forgiveness is a Choice. And I deliberately entitled that so it's not forgiveness is dragging you across the street where you have to do this or you're in trouble. And that is published by the American Psychological Association and available on Amazon.com.
Okay, thank you again, Bob. We did put your email address in the chat.
Oh,
And,
good.
Rhoda, I'll lend you my Forgiving Life book if you'd like. And we want to thank you again, Bob, for withstanding all of these attacks and maintaining this important body of work. And I think the last time I counted in the Bible, it says 6 times, stay strong and courageous. Please stay strong and courageous.
Thank you for that encouragement, Karen. I really appreciate it.
Persevere.
Thank you. I need that. Thank you for your encouragement. And thank you for letting me spend time with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you must have watched the hearings.
Yeah, right, right. I
That's
love
a great
that.
story.
It
Yeah.
is. Persevere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I